All right, what's going on, everyone? So, if you pay attention to the ongoing war in Ukraine online, it's easy to get the impression that the Russian military is falling apart at the seams, failing in every way possible, and could easily be swept aside by NATO or the United States in a matter of weeks. But that's not entirely true. In fact, there's some real arguments to be made that the Russian military today is more capable than they were when they first kicked off this war, this full-scale invasion 2 years ago. As you all know, not everything is black and white. There's a lot of nuance, so I'm glad you're here to walk through it. Today, we're going to be looking at some statements given by General Christopher Cavoli, the commander of the United States European Command, to the House Armed Services Committee on April 10, 2024. I will link the full transcript in the description below. I'm only going to be focusing on the aspects related to the war in Ukraine, the United States, and NATO. I don't want to give the impression that that's all he talked about. He's in charge of a European command. There's a lot of other threats in that area of the world. So if you want to dive into other aspects, again, that transcript is fully unclassified and in the description below. So a quick kind of overview here, what European command is. So there are 11 combatant commands in the United States, in the U.S. military, that combines different branches. So it's not just Army or just Air Force. It's everybody together in a sense. 6 of those commands are geographic. Some of them you've probably heard of, like Central Command in the Middle East. Obviously got a lot of attention over the last 20 plus years. And then today we're talking about European Command, which of course includes most of Europe. That's 6 of them based geographically. There's also 5 functional combatant commands like Cyber Command, Space Command, Special Operations Command, Strategic Command, and Transportation Command. Just kind of give you an idea of what we're getting into here. So looking at General Cavoli's statements, he started out by saying Russia remains a capable threat beyond Ukraine, and it's necessary to examine what has and what has not happened to the Russian military in Ukraine. Now, quick note on kind of the stance that General Cavoli is going to have here. I don't want to suggest that he might mislead or exaggerate the Russian capabilities. I have no evidence to suggest that he would do that in any way, shape, or form. But it is in his interest to highlight the threat that Russia still poses, right? So he's probably going to lean more in the direction of Russia has significant capabilities and we need more funding, resources, attention than not, right? Nobody in his position, in a senior government official position, benefits from downplaying a threat that is still out there, right? We've seen that play out in the war on terror where somebody will say, well, that threat is eliminated or no longer a significant issue for the United States, and then they strike and it makes the person look like they have no idea what they're talking about. So keep that in mind as we're going through. Again, I don't want that to suggest that he's exaggerating or overhyping the Russian threat. I think he has some really good points here. He says, first and foremost, Russia's nuclear forces have been unaffected by the conflict, and Russia retains the largest arsenal of deployed and non-deployed nuclear weapons in the world. These continue to present an existential threat to the U.S. homeland, our allies, and our partners. This is a piece of the war that got a lot of attention early on, talking about what could trigger a Russian nuclear response in Ukraine or against NATO countries. It's really fallen off the conversation as of late, but I think he does a good job of bringing that back to say, you know, this isn't even talking about what would cause Russia to use a nuke in Ukraine, which for a long time was the conversation, or the concern, I should say, a concern. He's saying, look, that has always been kind of the cornerstone of the Russian military. It's unaffected at this point. He gets into some additional details about how certain aspects of their nuclear forces have been modernized. It's not like they've just been falling apart. You know, there's a lot to be said about the storage and the how the readiness of the Russian nuclear forces. But what Cavoli gets to in some of these aspects here is that they're not falling apart at the seams, right? They still do pose a significant nuclear threat, and the war in Ukraine hasn't changed that. He says, during this conflict, Russia's strategic forces, long-range aviation, cyber capabilities, space capabilities, and capabilities in the electromagnetic spectrum have lost no capacity at all. The Air Force has lost some aircraft, but only about 10% of their fleet. The Navy has suffered significantly in the Black Sea, but nowhere else. And Russian naval activity worldwide is at a significant peak. Just think about that for a second. Again, it's so easy to get laser-focused, hyper-focused on what's happening in Ukraine and in the battle space around Ukraine when we see aircraft being shot out of the sky, helicopters being shot out of the sky, ships being sunk in the Black Sea. That was unexpected, right? Ukraine, a country with no real navy at this point, is sinking ships of the Russian Navy, and that's all significant when looking at the war in Ukraine. But when you back out a little bit and look at the overall Russian capabilities, he highlights here 10% of their Air Force. That's something, right? Nobody wants to lose 10% of their Air Force. That's not good for Russia. I don't want to pretend that, lean too far in that direction, but it's a far cry from the Air Force being incapacitated. And then pointing out that Russian naval activity worldwide is at a significant peak. Again, what we're seeing in Ukraine and in the Black Sea is a bit of a bubble and is not entirely reflective of the Russian military capabilities as a whole around the world. Cavoli says that Russian long-range precision fighters have increased in production, and Russia has also begun to buy ballistic missiles, cruise missiles, and long-range drones from third countries who were previously outside this fight. That aspect of being able to pull in munitions, parts, components, from North Korea and Iran, they're getting straight-up weaponry. When you look at China specifically, it doesn't appear at this point that there's weapons coming directly into Russia or military equipment, but a lot of dual-use components that can be used for civilian purposes, and a lot of times in Russia right now are being used for military purposes. You can't ignore that. I don't know that I would necessarily say those ties have strengthened in recent years, but we've seen the extent that those countries are willing to go to support Russia in this fight, and I don't think that was entirely known before this war kicked off. Now, getting into what I think is probably the most interesting aspect here, manpower and the ground fight. I think a little biased as an Army guy. I just tend to lean more towards this. But they say, Cavoli says, in fact, it is mainly only the land forces that Russia has suffered, losing over 2,000 tanks and 315,000 soldiers wounded or dead. However, Russia is reconstituting that force far faster than our initial estimates suggested. The army is actually larger now by 15% than it was when it invaded Ukraine. So I know casualty figures in this war are always a point of contention. So if you want to just take away that 350, you can just remove his casualty estimate entirely if you don't have any confidence in that. The major takeaway here for me is that the army is larger now by 15% than when they invaded Ukraine. And most significantly, Russia is reconstituting their forces far faster than our initial estimates suggested. A little bit of a caveat to the idea that the army is larger now than they were when they first invaded. That's not all that surprising. It's an army at war. This was not an army at war when they kicked off the invasion. And if you looked at how Russia was trying to kind of hide their intentions around this war, they weren't mobilizing large numbers of troops, right? It was relatively a localized effort. So the military hadn't grown to its wartime necessity at that point, if you will. It'd be very similar if you look back to the U.S. experience in Iraq and Afghanistan and grab a number out of 2006, 2007 and say, look, the United States military has grown significantly. Well, it grew because we needed those troops in the middle of a war. So 15%, the bigger takeaway for me there is that Russia is able to reconstitute forces much faster than expected. He says, over the past year, Russia increased its frontline troop strength from 360,000 to 470,000. Russia's army increased the upper age limit for conscription from 27 to 30, which increases the pool of available military conscripts by 2 million for years to come. Russia has also announced plans to pursue an ambitious ground forces restructure, increasing to 1.5 million personnel with an expanded footprint. Any of these long-term plans, especially with Russia, they've had such a hard time hitting some of these mid to long-term military goals with how they're going to either modify the force or grow the force. You got to take that with a grain of salt. They've had a hard time hitting those in the past. So just keep that back in mind. They're trying to get to that 1.5 million personnel. But the fact of increasing the conscription age just from 27 to 30, it doesn't look that crazy on paper, but with a country the size of Russia, as they point out, that's an additional 2 million conscripts that they can tap into. And this is a significant conversation right now because Ukraine is still battling the best way to go about increasing conscription across their country, right? It's not total and complete conscription from ages, 18 to 45 or something. Ukraine's been very specific in the certain age. I think they just lowered the age a little bit that they're going to start pulling people into the force, but it's the manpower on the battlefield cannot be ignored. It's a significant aspect of this fight. Cavoli says, perhaps most concerning, the Russian military in the past year has shown an accelerating ability to learn and adapt to battlefield challenges, both tactically and technologically, and has become a learning organization that little resembles the chaotic force that invaded Ukraine 2 years ago. This is what I was hinting at the beginning of this video when I said you watch online, you get this idea, and I think it's stuck. A lot of opinions of the Russian military are tied to what we saw in those opening days, weeks, maybe even months of the war in Ukraine, where it was absolute chaos. And you could it almost wasn't even worth analyzing because so many things were going wrong at once. It was hard to pinpoint what went wrong or what you shouldn't do. Like everything was just collapsing. Troops were moving out in front of their air defense bubble and getting hammered by the few Ukrainian drones that they had. Troops were not being resupplied. Like all sorts of problems, left and right. What he's pointing out is that is not the same military that Russia is today. That is not to say they don't make mistakes, but it's naive and detrimental for us to look at the Russian military today and say they haven't learned anything. They have. They're adapting every single day. And another point I want to call out here is kind of veering off tangent, but I think it's important. When you interact with Ukrainian soldiers and people in the Ukrainian armed forces, they are not dismissing the Russian capabilities. That dismissal of Russian capabilities and kind of downplaying what they can do tends to exist online. There's a respect, a healthy respect is the way I would put it, of Russia, of what Russia is capable of doing on the battlefield. Does not mean that the Ukrainian forces like the Russians by any stretch of the imagination, but they're not downplaying what Russia is capable of doing. They've seen it, they experience it. They have to try to survive in the middle of this war. There's no use in pretending that Russia is just making mistake after mistake, because a lot of what they're doing is still very, very, very lethal. He says Russia is on track to spend 6% of its GDP on the military, with defense spending exceeding social spending for the first time since the end of the Soviet Union. As a reference, I'll pull up a graph here. I believe the United States is around 3.5%, on or about. 6% of GDP on the military would put that at the top, I believe, around the world. So now you get into some nuance, talking economics about how much of that is, what's the total dollar amount? What does that translate to in the battlefield? But I think what that shows is that Russia's serious here. Again, for anybody thinking that Russia's kind of brushing this aside or not taking this war seriously or just going half in, that's not the case. They're all in. 6% GDP on military, above and beyond social spending for the first time since the end of the Soviet Union. Russia's all in on this war in Ukraine. They say Russia is on track to produce or refurbish over 1,200 new main battle tanks a year. Produce or refurbish, important aspect there. I think sometimes those get mixed. And to manufacture at least 3 million artillery shells or rockets per year, over triple the amount the U.S. estimated at the beginning of the war, and more ammunition than all 32 NATO allied countries combined. Again, a lot of this piece specifically was tied back into some of the sanctions and talking about how Russia has been able to essentially not necessarily evade sanctions, although that is a component of this, but kind of find workarounds and find ways to continue to increase their military production in spite of some of these sanctions. The production and refurbishment of main battle tanks is significant. That's a lot, and Russia has always had a lot of tanks, so it's not the new ones. Of course, you got to keep an eye on that, but the refurbishment is a major aspect here. And then 3 million artillery shells and rockets per year. We're not there in the United States. We're not there as NATO as a whole. And I think that's a direction that we're heading in, but I'm not sure that parity in ammunition production is in the cards. I'm not necessarily sure we want it to be in the cards. We have other capabilities that might be better suited for us to put more time and energy into certain things than, say, artillery shells. But either way, you can't deny that right now, and for a long time now, Russia has been significantly outproducing the broader West, if you will. And Cavoli hit on this even further, saying right now Ukraine is being outshot by Russia 5-1 in the artillery war. So the Russians fire 5 times as many artillery shells at the Ukrainians than the Ukrainians are able to fire back. That will immediately go to 10-1 in a matter of weeks. We're not talking about months. We're not talking hypothetically. He's talking about should Western funding reduce in any way or fall off. And it doesn't. This shouldn't be like a major shock at all. Russia is continuing to ramp up their ammunition production, and Ukraine is entirely dependent on Western aid. They are producing things in country, but nowhere near enough to maintain themselves independently in this fight with Russia. So if Western aid slows or falls off entirely, while Western aid falls off, while Russian military production increases, yeah, 10-to-1 artillery advantage doesn't sound crazy in the least. He says a strong and cohesive NATO is the cornerstone of deterrence and therefore is the basis for peace in the Euro-Atlantic. The alliance is more unified than at any point since the Cold War and is undergoing its most significant transformation in 3 decades as it modernizes its system of collective defense. I don't know, maybe the general watched my video the other day talking about how NATO is more unified now than ever. Just having come back from the couple days of the headquarters, this is what everybody's talking about there, is the Russian invasion of Ukraine and how to further to stop further Russian advances and to bring peace back to the European continent. So he did not. I'm certain the general does not watch my YouTube channel, but thought it was interesting that something he keyed in on there is also a takeaway from just being out there with that organization. He says, U.S. European Command's primary reason for being located inside of Europe is to enable NATO, and enabling NATO to deter and, if necessary, defeat Russia is the most important thing we do on a daily basis. So again, this whole this whole statement that he gave to the House, it touches on a lot of things. But the focus here, it was not that I had to go in and like peel out these Russian parts. It was more like I had to peel away the other things, because the vast majority of his talk was focused on Russia, on NATO, on deterrence, on U.S. capabilities in Europe. That is more and more. This is going back to a video I made just recently talking about how NATO is more unified than ever. It has brought a purpose back, if you will, to U.S. European Command. They've been very busy for a long time. Not to say the troops there and the soldiers, airmen, Marines haven't been busy for a long time, but this is kind of hyper-focused that combatant command on the threat that Russia poses to the continent. And in wrapping up, he says, the more the U.S. invests to strengthen the alliance now, the less we will need to provide in the future. I thought it was interesting he kind of veered off of the just talking about Russia, just talking about U.S. military capabilities, and spent some time talking about making sure that it's not just the U.S., but that we enable our allies, specifically our NATO allies in the region. I know that NATO as a whole has become somewhat of a contentious subject as of late. I think it's probably increased because of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Just the idea that a NATO country could pull the United States into a war that the general population, may or may not want to be a part of. So it's not shocking then that General Cavoli, as a part of his statement here, talks about how strengthening this alliance, making NATO stronger, more formidable, decreases the likelihood of a future large-scale war with someone like Russia. But again, I'll link this full speech in the description below if you want to go through it. Again, there's more to it than just the Russian aspect, Ukraine, NATO, and how the U.S. is responding to the Russian invasion of Ukraine. That's all I got for now. Of course, if interested in this or other national security subjects, be sure to check out our Substack. It's linked in the description below as well. We renamed that recently to Between the Lines with Preston Stewart, because we're covering a lot of things. And it's not just me. We brought in some experts, researchers, analysts, writers to cover things from Islamic State to a lot going on in Gaza, of course, Africa, China, Russia, just a broad range of security and national security subjects that I think are interesting and are linked for free in the description below. But thanks for watching, and I'll see y'all next time.